Stand on the southern coast of Spain on a clear day. Look across the water. You can see another continent. Not another country, not another island. Another continent. Africa. It's right there. Close enough to see with the naked eye. Only 13 kilometers separate Europe from Africa at the narrowest point of the Strait of Gibraltar. That's less than the distance many people drive to work every morning. Less than the length of countless bridges already standing around the world. And yet something strange exists here. There is no bridge, no tunnel, no permanent connection of any kind, nothing. People still cross this stretch of water almost exactly the same way they did thousands of years ago, by boat. How is that possible? We have bridges stretching for over 100 kilometers. We have tunnels beneath mountains. We have tunnels beneath oceans. We have sent spacecraft billions of kilometers into space. And yet humanity has never connected Europe and Africa. At first glance, building a bridge here seems obvious. The distance is short. The technology exists. The economic importance is enormous. So why hasn't it happened? The answer is far more complicated than most people imagine. Because the Strait of Gibraltar isn't just a narrow strip of water. It's one of the most important locations on Earth. A place where geology, economics, politics, history, and engineering collide, and where every solution creates a new problem. To understand why this bridge doesn't exist, we first need to understand what the Strait of Gibraltar really is. For thousands of years, this place marked the edge of the known world. Ancient Greeks and Romans believed these waters were guarded by the legendary Pillars of Hercules, two giant cliffs standing on opposite sides of the strait. Beyond them lay the unknown, the endless Atlantic Ocean. For ancient sailors, crossing these waters wasn't just a journey. It was a leap into uncertainty. The Mediterranean was familiar, safe, predictable. The Atlantic was something else entirely. Wild, dangerous, mysterious. Perhaps that's why the dream of permanently connecting these shores has fascinated people for centuries. Because this isn't just a bridge between two countries. It's a bridge between two continents. A bridge between Europe and Africa. And despite all our technological achievements, it still doesn't exist. The Strait of Gibraltar isn't just geographically important, it's economically essential. Without it, the modern world would look very different. This narrow passage is the only natural connection between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Everything moving between those two bodies of water must pass through here. Every year, more than 100,000 ships squeeze through this corridor. Think about that number, more than 100,000. For comparison, the Panama Canal handles around 14 ships annually. The Suez Canal handles roughly 20. The difference is staggering. At almost any hour of the day, the Strait of Gibraltar resembles a traffic jam. Not of cars, of floating skyscrapers, container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, cruise ships, military vessels, an endless procession of steel giants moving between continents. Some of the largest ships on Earth pass through these waters. Many carry enough cargo to supply entire nations. Others transport energy that powers economies thousands of kilometers away. Oil is especially important. Hundreds of tankers cross the strait every single day. Massive quantities of crude oil flow through this narrow gap between continents. The value of the cargo moving through Gibraltar is measured not in millions, but in trillions of dollars. That traffic created enormous ports on both sides. On the Spanish side, major ports handle goods flowing into Europe. On the Moroccan side, Tanger Med has become one of the fastest-growing ports in the world. Today, it serves as one of Africa's most important trade gateways. Both countries continue expanding, building new terminals, adding new infrastructure, competing for global trade. And that's where the first major problem appears. A bridge sounds useful, but useful for whom? Because the ships already move efficiently, passengers already cross by ferry, planes connect both sides in minutes, cargo already flows through some of the world's busiest ports. The economic argument for a bridge isn't nearly as obvious as it first appears, and that creates a dangerous question. What if the bridge costs billions, but never pays for itself? At first glance, the solution seems obvious. Build a bridge, charge tolls, collect billions, problem solved. But infrastructure doesn't work that way, especially not infrastructure this expensive. Most estimates place the cost of a Gibraltar crossing somewhere between $5 and $20 billion. Some engineers believe the real figure could be even higher, and that's before accounting for delays, inflation, maintenance, and unexpected complications. The real question isn't whether we can build it. The real question is whether we should. Because unlike many famous megaprojects, the Strait of Gibraltar doesn't suffer from a transportation problem. People already cross it every day, millions of them. Fast ferries connect Spain and Morocco in as little as 30 minutes. Even the slower crossings rarely take more than an hour. For many travelers, that's faster than a daily commute in a major city. Airlines also provide quick connections. Private vessels cross constantly. The transportation network already exists. A bridge wouldn't create a connection. It would simply replace one that already works, and cargo presents an even bigger challenge. Most goods crossing between Europe and Africa aren't transported by truck. They're transported by ship, because ships are incredibly efficient. A single container vessel can carry more cargo than thousands of trucks. Moving freight by sea remains cheaper than almost any land-based alternative, which means a bridge would struggle to attract enough traffic to justify its enormous cost. History offers several warnings. Take the Channel Tunnel between Britain and France, one of the greatest engineering achievements of the modern era. Construction cost the equivalent of roughly $14.5 billion. Today, it carries around 20 million passengers every year. Yet for years, investors struggled to recover their money. Or consider the famous Øresund Bridge linking Denmark and Sweden, a spectacular structure, an engineering masterpiece. Yet its financial performance never fully matched early expectations, and both of those projects connect regions with far larger daily commuter traffic than Gibraltar. Now imagine spending even more money on a bridge between two continents, where ferries already perform the job efficiently. The numbers become uncomfortable very quickly. But economics isn't the only concern. In fact, the biggest source of income in the region isn't passenger transport at all. It's shipping. Those 100 vessels moving through the strait generate enormous economic activity. Ports, fuel services, logistics, warehousing, repairs, trade. Entire industries depend on that maritime traffic, and if a bridge interfered with it, even slightly, the consequences could be enormous. The bridge wouldn't just need to justify its own cost, it would need to avoid damaging one of the world's most valuable shipping corridors. That's a very difficult balancing act. Still, let's imagine money isn't an issue. Suppose governments and investors somehow find the billions required. Would building the bridge finally become easy? Not even close, because distance was never the real problem. Engineering is, and the first engineering obstacle is far larger than most people realize. The ships. Modern container vessels aren't just large, they're gigantic. Some carry more than 24 containers, stacked high above the water like floating apartment buildings. Standing beside one feels less like looking at a ship and more like looking at a moving city. And every year they get bigger. That means any bridge crossing the Strait of Gibraltar must allow these giants to pass beneath it safely. A drawbridge is impossible. The traffic volume is simply too high. With hundreds of vessels passing daily, the bridge would spend most of its life open. Cars would back up for kilometers. The crossing would become useless, so the bridge would need a fixed span. A very high fixed span. High enough for today's largest ships and tomorrow's even larger ones. Engineers could certainly build something that tall, but every meter of additional height dramatically increases cost. Approach roads become longer, support structures become larger, wind loads become stronger. Maintenance becomes more complicated, and the budget keeps growing. Yet even this isn't the greatest challenge, not even close, because the true enemy isn't above the water, it's below it, hidden beneath the surface. Deep inside the earth itself. And that's where this story becomes truly terrifying. If engineers only had to worry about money, the bridge might already exist. If they only had to worry about ships, they could probably find a solution. But the Strait of Gibraltar has another problem, one that no amount of money can eliminate: the Earth itself. Beneath these waters lies one of the most geologically active regions in Europe. This is where two enormous tectonic plates meet: the Eurasian plate and the African plate. Slowly, relentlessly, they are moving toward each other, only a few millimeters each year. But over geological time, that's enough to reshape continents. And whenever tectonic plates interact, the result is rarely peaceful. Pressure builds, stress accumulates. Eventually, something breaks, the ground shakes, and earthquakes are born. That means any bridge built here would not simply need to withstand storms and heavy traffic. It would need to survive major seismic events, not once, not twice, but repeatedly throughout its lifetime. Engineers would not be asking, "Will there be another earthquake?" They would be asking, "When?" History provides a frightening answer. On November 1st, 1755, one of the most devastating earthquakes in European history struck near the Iberian Peninsula, the Lisbon earthquake. Within minutes, much of Portugal's capital was destroyed. Buildings collapsed, churches crumbled, entire neighborhoods disappeared. But the earthquake itself was not the worst part. Moments later came the tsunami. Massive waves surged across the Atlantic coast, striking Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. Entire coastal communities were devastated. Ships were thrown inland. Thousands of people who had survived the earthquake were killed by the water that followed. Modern estimates suggest the disaster claimed tens of thousands of lives. Some historians believe it fundamentally changed European thinking. People began questioning whether nature could ever truly be controlled. For engineers considering a bridge across Gibraltar, the lesson is clear. The forces that created that catastrophe have not disappeared. They are still here, still moving, still building pressure beneath the seabed. And the Lisbon earthquake was not an isolated event. Throughout history, this region has experienced numerous powerful earthquakes. In the 20th century, another major quake devastated parts of Morocco. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands of lives were lost. The geological threat remains very real. And unlike many engineering problems, it cannot be solved. You cannot stop tectonic plates. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot convince them to move somewhere else. You can only design around them, and that is an expensive challenge. But earthquakes are not the only danger hidden beneath the strait. The seabed itself presents another nightmare, one that may be even more difficult to overcome. Most people assume the shortest crossing would naturally be the easiest place to build. That is not necessarily true. In fact, the narrowest part of the Strait of Gibraltar may be one of the worst places imaginable for a major structure. Because beneath the water lies a complex landscape of deep underwater channels, unstable sediments, and thick layers of soft clay. At first glance, clay doesn't sound particularly threatening, but engineers know better. Soft marine clay behaves unpredictably. It compresses, flows under pressure, and reacts badly to seismic activity. A bridge needs foundations, enormous foundations. The larger the bridge, the more critical those foundations become. If the ground moves, the structure moves. And when you're dealing with one of the largest bridges ever attempted, even small movements can become catastrophic. Geological surveys have repeatedly highlighted this problem. Unlike the English Channel, where engineers benefited from relatively stable rock formations, Gibraltar presents a much more hostile environment. Some sections contain sediment deposits that accumulated over millions of years. loose, unstable, and difficult to anchor into securely. In other words, the challenge isn't simply building the bridge, it's finding something trustworthy to build it on. And the deeper scientists looked, the worse the picture became. The very location where Europe and Africa come closest together may actually be one of the least suitable places for a crossing. It's a cruel irony. The shortest route is also one of the most dangerous. But how did this place become so complicated? Why is the geology here so unusual? To answer that question, we need to travel back millions of years. Back to a time when the Mediterranean Sea didn't exist as we know it today. Back to one of the most extraordinary events in the history of our planet. An event so massive that it reshaped continents, created an entire sea, and carved the Strait of Gibraltar itself. To understand why the Strait of Gibraltar is such a difficult place to build anything, we need to go back millions of years. Long before Spain existed. Long before Africa looked the way it does today. Long before humans ever walked the earth, because the Mediterranean Sea was not always a sea. In fact, there was a time when it almost vanished completely. It sounds impossible. Today, the Mediterranean covers more than 2.5 million square kilometers. It is surrounded by dozens of countries. It has shaped civilizations, empires, religions, and global trade. Yet around 6 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. The connection between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean was off. The gateway that once allowed ocean water to enter the basin gradually closed, and the consequences were catastrophic. The Mediterranean began to evaporate. At first, the change was slow, but year after year, under the intense southern sun, more water disappeared than rivers could replace. The sea level started falling, then falling faster and faster, until what had once been a vast sea became something almost unimaginable. A gigantic basin of salt deserts, isolated lakes, and barren landscapes. Some scientists believe parts of the Mediterranean dropped more than 3 kilometers below the level of the Atlantic Ocean. Think about that. Entire mountain ranges today are lower than the depth of this ancient depression. If you had stood there at the time, you would not have seen a sea. You would have seen a giant, scorching wasteland stretching beyond the horizon. A landscape covered in thick layers of salt. A place hotter, drier, and more hostile than almost anywhere on Earth. This period is known as the Messinian salinity crisis, and it remains one of the most extraordinary geological events ever discovered. Evidence of it still exists today. Deep beneath the Mediterranean floor lie enormous deposits of salt, thousands of cubic kilometers of it, silent proof that an entire sea nearly evaporated away. But the most dramatic chapter was yet to come, because eventually the natural barrier separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean failed. Nobody knows exactly how it began. Perhaps a small channel formed, perhaps erosion weakened the rock. Perhaps an earthquake accelerated the process. Whatever happened, once Atlantic water found a path through, there was no stopping it. The ocean broke through, and one of the greatest floods in Earth's history began. Imagine a waterfall unlike anything humanity has ever witnessed. Not hundreds of meters wide, not even kilometers wide, an ocean pouring into a basin. Scientists estimate that the flow may have been thousands of times greater than the Amazon River. The largest river on Earth. Now multiply that by hundreds, or even thousands. Water thundered into the empty Mediterranean basin with unimaginable force, day after day, month after month, year after year. The sound alone would have been deafening. A constant roar that could probably have been heard for hundreds of kilometers. Entire landscapes were carved away, rock was ripped apart, valleys deepened, and gradually the Mediterranean filled again. What had become a giant salt desert transformed back into a sea. Some estimates suggest the entire process may have taken less than 2 years. Others argue it lasted several decades. Either way, in geological terms, it happened almost instantly. One of the largest bodies of water on Earth was reborn, and in the process, the Strait of Gibraltar was created. The narrow passage we see today is the scar left behind by that ancient flood, a permanent reminder of one of the most violent geological events our planet has ever experienced. Even now, the story isn't over. The Mediterranean still depends on Gibraltar. Every single day, Atlantic water flows through the strait. Without it, the Mediterranean would once again begin losing more water through evaporation than it receives from rivers. Slowly but inevitably, it would start shrinking. The strait functions like a giant life support system, a narrow artery keeping an entire sea alive, and the water flowing through it doesn't just maintain sea levels, it supports ecosystems, trade routes, climate systems, and marine life. The exchange is remarkably complex. Less salty Atlantic water enters at the surface. Meanwhile, denser Mediterranean water exits beneath it through deep underwater currents. Two massive rivers moving in opposite directions through the same narrow passage. One above, one below, invisible to the eye, but absolutely essential. Without this exchange, the Mediterranean ecosystem would collapse. Which brings us to another problem engineers must consider. The Strait of Gibraltar isn't just important for humans, it's important for nature too. And nature doesn't always cooperate with megaprojects. The waters here are among the richest in marine biodiversity anywhere in Europe. Whales pass through, dolphins pass through, sea turtles pass through. Entire ecosystems depend on these currents. One of the most fascinating residents is a small population of orcas, killer whales, roughly a few dozen individuals that have made these waters their home. They follow migrating tuna through the strait, hunting in one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. It's an extraordinary coexistence, but not an easy one. The endless procession of ships creates noise, pollution, collisions, and increasing pressure on wildlife. Many species are already under stress, which creates another question. Would a bridge make things better or worse? Some environmentalists argue that reducing shipping congestion could help marine life. Others fear that large-scale construction would cause enormous ecological disruption. Either way, any future crossing would face intense environmental scrutiny. And the wildlife isn't limited to the sea. Above the strait, another migration takes place, one of the largest on the planet. Twice every year, millions of birds cross between Europe and Africa, using the Strait of Gibraltar as a natural highway. The crossing is short, the conditions are favorable, and the route has been used for thousands of years. Eagles, storks, vultures, and countless other species depend on it. It's one of the busiest migration corridors on Earth. A bridge would need to coexist not only with ships and marine life, but with entire aerial ecosystems as well. And then there's one final layer to this story: humans. Because people have been drawn to these shores for far longer than anyone imagined. Long before modern nations, long before ports, long before empires, humans were already here, watching these waters, crossing them, and wondering what lay on the other side. In fact, some of the last Neanderthals on Earth may have lived right here. And their story reveals just how important this narrow strip of water has always been. If geology is the physical obstacle to a bridge between Europe and Africa, politics may be the bigger one. Because long before engineers began drawing plans for bridges and tunnels, nations were already fighting over this narrow strip of water. For thousands of years, the Strait of Gibraltar has been one of the most valuable strategic locations on Earth. Whoever controls it controls the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Every empire understood this. The Phoenicians, the Romans, the Moors, the Spanish, the British, all recognized the same thing. This was not just a piece of coastline. It was a key to global trade, and nowhere is that more obvious than Gibraltar itself. The famous Rock of Gibraltar rises dramatically above the entrance to the Mediterranean. Visible for kilometers, a natural fortress carved from limestone, one of the most recognizable landmarks in Europe. But here is the strange part. Gibraltar is not Spanish. It is not Moroccan. It is British. A tiny piece of the United Kingdom attached to the southern tip of Spain, thousands of kilometers from London, and yet officially British territory. The story goes back more than 300 years. During the War of the Spanish Succession, British forces captured Gibraltar. Later, Spain formally ceded it under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The arrangement was supposed to settle the matter. It did not. 3 centuries later, Spain still claims Gibraltar should return to Spanish sovereignty. Britain disagrees. And most importantly, the people who actually live there disagree too. Over multiple referendums, Gibraltar's residents have overwhelmingly voted to remain British. The margins were not even close. In one referendum, more than 98% rejected joint sovereignty with Spain. Even during Brexit, when Gibraltar was forced to leave the European Union alongside the United Kingdom, the vast majority voted to remain in Europe, but they left anyway. The result is one of the most unusual political situations on the planet. A British territory attached to Spain, inside one of the world's most important shipping corridors, and sitting directly beside a project that would require unprecedented international cooperation. If that sounds complicated, it gets worse, because Spain has a territorial problem of its own. Across the water, on the African coast, sit 2 cities, Ceuta and Melilla. Unlike Gibraltar, these cities belong to Spain, but they are located in Africa, completely surrounded by Moroccan territory. For centuries, Spain has controlled them. For centuries, Morocco has argued they should belong to Morocco. Sound familiar? The parallels are impossible to ignore. Spain says Gibraltar should return because it is geographically part of Spain. Morocco says Ceuta and Melilla should return because they are geographically part of Morocco. Neither side is willing to compromise. Both insist their territories are non-negotiable. It is a perfect political mirror. Each country demands the return of territory, while refusing to surrender territory claimed by the other. And because these enclaves sit directly on migration routes between Africa and Europe, they have become even more politically sensitive. Massive border fences surround them. Advanced surveillance systems monitor them. Their strategic importance has only increased over time. Now imagine trying to build a multi-billion-dollar bridge between countries carrying that much historical baggage. The challenge quickly stops being engineering and starts becoming diplomacy. Even the water itself is disputed. Most of the strait falls under Spanish and Moroccan influence, but British claims around Gibraltar complicate matters. Maritime boundaries overlap, jurisdictions overlap, political interests overlap. And every major infrastructure project requires agreements on issues that have remained unresolved for decades. Who pays? Who controls it? Who maintains it? Who secures it? Who collects tolls? What happens during disputes? What laws apply? Questions that sound boring on paper can kill projects worth billions, because investors hate uncertainty. And there are few places on Earth with more political uncertainty than a strategic choke point shared by multiple governments with competing interests. That is why many experts believe the greatest barrier to a Gibraltar crossing is not earthquakes, or engineering, or even money. It is trust, or rather, the lack of it. And yet, despite all these obstacles, the dream refuses to die. For more than a century, engineers have continued searching for ways to connect Europe and Africa. Some proposals were ambitious, some were visionary, and some were completely insane. But among all these ideas, one solution keeps returning again and again. Not a bridge, a tunnel. Because while a bridge must fight the wind, the ships, and the storms, a tunnel can hide beneath them all. At least in theory. The problem is that the Strait of Gibraltar may be one of the most difficult places on Earth to build a tunnel, and the story of those failed attempts is just as fascinating as the bridge itself. For most engineers, the bridge is no longer the favorite solution. The tunnel is. On paper, it solves many of the biggest problems immediately. Ships? no longer an issue. Hurricanes and Atlantic storms, irrelevant. Air traffic, unaffected. The impact, minimal. At first glance, a tunnel seems like the perfect answer, and that's exactly why governments have spent decades studying it. The dream isn't new, far from it. In fact, serious discussions about a tunnel beneath the Strait of Gibraltar date back nearly a century. As early as the 1930s, Spanish engineers were already exploring possible routes. The idea seemed straightforward. Europe and Africa were separated by just a narrow strip of water. Surely a tunnel was possible. Then reality arrived. The geology was far worse than expected. The technology of the time simply wasn't capable of handling the conditions beneath the strait. The project was quietly shelved. Then came World War II, and suddenly, digging a tunnel between continents became the least of anyone's concerns. For decades, the dream remained exactly that, a dream, but it never disappeared completely. Every generation of engineers returned to the same question: what if? What if Europe and Africa could finally be connected? What if trains could travel directly between the two continents? What if passengers could cross in minutes rather than hours? What if freight could move without ferries? The potential was enormous, so studies continued. And every new study uncovered the same uncomfortable truth. The Strait of Gibraltar is one of the most difficult places on Earth to tunnel through. The biggest problem isn't the water above, it's the rock below, or more accurately, the lack of reliable rock. Unlike the Channel Tunnel connecting Britain and France, Gibraltar doesn't offer engineers a long, stable layer of predictable geology. Instead, the seabed is a chaotic mixture of faults, fractured formations, unstable sediments, and soft clay deposits. Some sections are strong, others are dangerously weak. Some areas over time, others sit near active fault zones. For tunnel designers, that's a nightmare. A tunnel boring machine loves consistency. The strait offers the exact opposite. Every kilometer presents new geological surprises. Every survey seems to uncover another complication. And then there's the depth. Many people assume a tunnel would simply follow the shortest route. It won't. Engineers have already ruled out several direct alignments. The narrowest point of the strait turns out to be one of the least favorable places to build. The ground conditions are simply too dangerous. As a result, most modern proposals take a longer route, a safer route, one that sacrifices distance in exchange for stability. But that creates a new problem. Longer tunnels mean higher costs, more ventilation, more safety systems, more emergency exits, more maintenance, more risk. And suddenly the budget starts climbing again. By the 1980s, Spain and Morocco began discussing the idea seriously. For the first time, governments from both sides explored what a future crossing might actually look like. Committees were formed, studies were commissioned, experts were hired. The vision was ambitious: a permanent rail link connecting Europe and Africa. Not a road tunnel, a railway tunnel. Something similar to the Channel Tunnel beneath the English Channel. Passengers and freight would travel by train. Cars could potentially be transported on shuttle services. The idea seemed realistic until the technical details arrived. Engineers discovered another major obstacle. The railways on either side of the strait weren't fully compatible. Standards differed, infrastructure differed, operational systems differed. Even if the tunnel existed tomorrow, large portions of the surrounding network would still need upgrading. The tunnel wasn't the entire project. It was only the beginning. And every new complication pushed the timeline further into the future. Then came another challenge: money. Again, governments changed. Economic priorities shifted. Financial crises came and went, and the tunnel quietly slipped down the list of national priorities. Every few years, the idea would return. A new study, a new announcement, a new wave of optimism. Then silence. Then another study. Then another delay. The project became famous for one thing: never quite happening. Yet, despite all this, the dream refuses to die. In recent years, interest has returned once again. Spain and Morocco have reopened discussions. New feasibility studies have been launched. Political leaders have met. Experts have updated cost estimates, and ambitious statements have once again appeared in headlines. Some reports suggest construction could begin during the next decade. Others remain deeply skeptical because they've heard similar promises before, many times before. And the fundamental challenges haven't disappeared. The geology remains difficult. The costs remain enormous. The politics remain complicated. And the risks remain significant. Still, compared to a bridge, the tunnel has one enormous advantage. It doesn't interfere with shipping. The 100 vessels crossing Gibraltar every year could continue operating normally. The global trade routes remain untouched. The ports remain unaffected. The economic engine keeps running. That is why most serious proposals today focus on tunnels rather than bridges. But not everyone gave up on the bridge. In fact, some engineers became even more ambitious, far more ambitious. They started imagining structures so extraordinary that they sounded like science fiction. Bridges larger than anything humanity has ever built. Floating crossings suspended beneath the sea. Artificial islands. Entire energy-producing megacities sitting in the middle of the strait. Ideas so bold they seem impossible, and yet some of them were designed by some of the most respected engineers in the world. At this point, most people would probably give up. The economics are questionable. The geology is hostile. The politics are messy. The risks are enormous. But engineers are not most people. Engineers look at impossible problems and immediately start asking a dangerous question. What if? What if the bridge did not have to follow conventional rules? What if we built something humanity had never attempted before? What if the Strait of Gibraltar became the location of the most ambitious infrastructure project in history? Over the years, some truly astonishing ideas have emerged. Ideas that sound less like transportation projects and more like science fiction. And surprisingly, some of them came from some of the most respected engineers on Earth. One proposal became particularly famous. It came from one of America's most celebrated bridge designers, an engineer responsible for some of the world's most impressive long-span structures. His idea was breathtaking. Instead of focusing on the shortest crossing, he proposed connecting two capes located slightly farther apart. The total distance would still be around 14 kilometers. But the truly shocking part was not the length, it was the central span. A single span stretching nearly 5 meters, 5 kilometers, without intermediate supports. To understand how absurd that sounds, consider this. The longest suspension bridge spans on Earth measure around 2 kilometers. This proposal would more than double that. It would instantly become the largest bridge span ever attempted by humanity. The towers alone would likely rank among the tallest structures on Earth, visible from dozens of kilometers away, standing like giant gateways between continents. The bridge would need entirely new structural solutions, new materials, new aerodynamic systems, new construction methods. Everything would be pushed beyond existing limits. And even then, the Atlantic winds would constantly test its stability. Back in the 1990s, estimates suggested a cost of around $15 billion. Adjusted for today, the real figure could easily approach 30 billion. Not surprisingly, the project never moved beyond the conceptual stage. But if that bridge sounded ambitious, the next proposal was completely insane. Because one architect looked at the problem and decided that bridges should not necessarily stand above the water. They should float beneath it. His idea was called a submerged floating tunnel, and it remains one of the most fascinating infrastructure concepts ever proposed. Imagine a giant tube suspended approximately 200 meters below the ocean surface, not resting on the seabed, not supported by massive foundations, simply floating in the water. Held in position by a network of cables and anchors. Above it, ships would pass freely, even the largest container vessels on Earth. Future ships, ships not yet invented, none of them would ever notice the tunnel beneath. Inside, vehicles and trains would move between continents completely protected from weather and waves. No storms, no winds, no bridge towers, no shipping restrictions. The concept sounds impossible. Yet engineers have studied similar systems for decades. No full-scale version has ever been built, but technically, many experts believe it could work. The Gibraltar Strait would be the ultimate test, and that was not even the most ambitious part, because the proposal included something even more extraordinary. A giant artificial island in the middle of the strait, not a tiny platform, an actual island. Large enough to support hotels, restaurants, marinas, research centers, parks, observation decks, and transportation hubs. A floating city positioned between Europe and Africa, a new landmark visible from both continents. But the designer wanted even more. He envisioned the island becoming one of the largest renewable energy projects in the region. Wind turbines would generate electricity above the surface. Tidal turbines would harvest energy below. Ocean currents would help power the structure. The entire complex could potentially produce enormous amounts of clean energy. Some estimates suggested enough electricity to supply significant portions of southern Spain and northern Morocco. A bridge, a tunnel, a power plant, a tourist destination, and an engineering icon, all combined into a single mega project. The estimated cost? Roughly $10 billion. Which somehow sounds almost reasonable compared to some modern mega projects. Of course, nobody is building it. At least, not yet. But these proposals reveal something important. The real obstacle is no longer imagination. Human imagination solved the problem long ago. The obstacle is turning those dreams into reality, and reality is expensive. Reality is political. Reality is geological. Reality doesn't care how beautiful the design looks on paper, because ultimately, every proposal collides with the same brutal question: why build it? And that's where the entire story comes full circle. After everything we've seen, the answer might surprise you. The biggest obstacle isn't technology, it isn't engineering, it isn't even money. It's the fact that the Strait of Gibraltar already works perfectly. Every year, more than 100 ships pass through these waters. Ports are thriving, trade is growing, ferries move millions of passengers, airplanes connect both sides daily. The system isn't broken, and when a system isn't broken, spending tens of billions to replace it becomes difficult to justify, especially when every solution creates new problems. A bridge threatens shipping, a tunnel battles geology. Both face political complications. Both require massive investments. Both carry significant risks. Meanwhile, ships continue crossing, day after day, year after year, generating billions of dollars for everyone involved. From a purely economic perspective, the status quo is hard to beat. That doesn't mean a connection will never happen. In fact, many experts believe a rail tunnel remains the most realistic long-term solution. As technology improves, as trade between Europe and Africa grows, as political relationships evolve, the balance may eventually shift. One day, trains may travel beneath the strait. Passengers may move directly between continents in minutes. Europe and Africa may finally become physically connected. But if it happens, it probably won't be because humanity desperately needed the connection. It will happen because the benefits finally outweigh the risks. And that day hasn't arrived yet. For now, the Strait of Gibraltar remains one of the last great gaps in the modern world, a place where two continents stand almost face to face, close enough to see each other. Close enough to touch on a map, yet still separated by water, separated by geology, separated by history, separated by politics. And perhaps that is what makes it so fascinating. Because sometimes the most interesting question is not, can we build it? It is, why have not we? And in the case of the bridge that should exist, the answer is far more complicated than the distance between two shores. Only 13 kilometers separate Europe from Africa. but those 13 kilometers may be among the most difficult on Earth. And until someone finds a way to overcome every obstacle at once, people will continue crossing the Strait of Gibraltar exactly as they have for thousands of years. Not by bridge, not by tunnel, but by sea.